There's something strange that happens when people start earning more money. For the first few weeks, maybe the first couple of months, it feels different. There's more room, more breathing space between paychecks. The constant mental calculation of whether you can afford something, it softens a little. But then, without anyone announcing it, without any specific decision being made, something shifts. 6 months later, a year later, you're back to the same feeling. The same tightness, the same mental math at the grocery store, the same uncomfortable awareness that you probably shouldn't buy that thing you want, even though technically you can afford it. You're earning more, sometimes significantly more, but it doesn't feel like you're getting ahead. This isn't about being bad with money. This happens to people who are careful, people who track their spending, people who read personal finance books and listen to podcasts and genuinely try to make smart decisions. It happens to someone making $40,000 a year, and it happens to someone making $400,000 a year. The numbers change. The feeling doesn't. And here's what makes it so disorienting. You can't point to where the money went wrong. There's no obvious villain, no catastrophic purchase, no reckless spending spree that derailed everything. If you look at your bank statements, everything makes sense. Rent went up, but that's normal. You needed a more reliable car. The insurance premiums increased. You moved to a neighborhood with better schools or shorter commutes or just fewer things that made you feel unsafe. You started buying organic produce because you read something about pesticides. You upgraded your phone plan because the old one didn't have enough data. You joined the gym that you actually use instead of the cheap one you never went to. Each decision was rational, justified, small enough to not feel significant. But together, they reconstructed your entire cost of living around your new income level, leaving you with the same financial anxiety you had before, just with nicer things surrounding it. And most people never stop to ask why. Let's sit with this for a moment. You get a raise. Let's say it's a good one, 10%, maybe 15%. For someone making $60,000 a year, that's an extra $6,000 to $9,000. Real money. Money that should make a visible difference. At first, it does. Maybe you pay off a credit card. Maybe you finally replace that thing that's been broken for months. Maybe you just relax a little. Stop checking your bank account 3 times a week. But here's what happens next. And it's so gradual that most people don't even notice it happening. Your rent goes up because it always does. And this time, you don't fight it as hard. It's a $50 increase. You're making more now. It's fine. You upgrade your phone plan because the old one was frustrating and the new one is only $20 more a month. That's nothing compared to what you're making now. You start ordering delivery a little more often. Not excessively, just you're working hard, you're tired, it's justified. You buy a slightly nicer version of the things you were already buying. Not luxury items, just the normal version instead of the budget version. The name brand instead of the generic. The medium coffee instead of the small. None of these decisions feel significant. None of them feel like a choice to give up financial progress. They feel like you're finally living at the level you've earned, like you're catching up to where you should have been all along. And then quietly, without drama or announcement, your new income becomes your new normal. The breathing room disappears. You're back to living paycheck to paycheck, or close to it, or close enough that it doesn't feel meaningfully different than before. The subscriptions multiply. That streaming service you added because it had one show you wanted to watch. The meal kit delivery you signed up for during a busy week that somehow became permanent. The gym membership you're definitely going to use more often now that you can afford the nicer one. Each one is $10 here, $15 there. Individually insignificant. Collectively, there are second car payments worth of monthly obligations you've barely registered. Your standards shift in ways you don't articulate, even to yourself. The grocery store you used to shop at now feels somehow inadequate. You find yourself at the nicer one, the one with better produce and ambient lighting that doesn't make you want to leave immediately. The bill is 30% higher, but the experience is so much better. You're worth it, aren't you? You deserve fresh arugula that doesn't wilt by tomorrow. Social expectations creep upward too. Your friends want to try that new restaurant everyone's talking about. It's expensive, but you just got a raise. They know this because you mentioned it briefly in a moment of excitement you now regret. Saying no feels cheap. Saying no feels like you're not participating in your own life. So you say yes, and the $100 dinner becomes the new baseline for what going out means. This is where it gets uncomfortable, because the logical response is to blame yourself, to assume you're doing something wrong, to think that if you just had more discipline, more willpower, more financial literacy, you wouldn't be in this position. But here's the thing most people don't realize. This isn't happening because you lack discipline. It's happening because you're operating inside a system, and the system is designed to expand to meet whatever income you have. The reason this feels so confusing is because on the surface, it doesn't make sense. You're making more money, you should have more money. That's how math works. But money isn't just math, it's behavior, it's psychology, it's 1,000 small decisions compounding over time, most of which don't feel like decisions at all. And here's the part that makes smart people feel stupid. You know what you're supposed to do. You've heard the advice. Save more, invest a difference, pay yourself first, automate your savings, live below your means. You understand these concepts intellectually, but understanding them doesn't seem to change what actually happens. Because the advice assumes that your spending is a conscious, controlled variable, something you decide on with intention. And it's not. Most spending isn't a decision, it's a response to a baseline that's already been set. That baseline is invisible to you. You didn't choose it deliberately. It emerged over time, shaped by where you live, what your friends do, what feels normal for someone in your situation, what your brain has categorized as necessary versus extra. Think about it this way. When was the last time you sat down and actually decided what your life should cost? Not your budget, your life. The apartment size you need, the neighborhood quality you require, the car reliability you won't compromise on, the food quality you've come to expect, the convenience level you've integrated into your routine. Most people never explicitly choose these things. They inherit them from their peer group, absorb them from their environment, adopt them gradually as their income permits. Your brain doesn't experience this as lifestyle creep. It experiences it as finally living correctly, as catching up to normal, as fixing inefficiencies that were holding you back when you couldn't afford better. The old neighborhood wasn't really you anyway. The budget groceries were a temporary compromise. The inconvenient commute was something you were always going to fix eventually. And now you have. These aren't luxuries, they're corrections. They're what your life was supposed to look like all along, before financial constraints forced you into a lesser version of it. And once that baseline is set, it's incredibly difficult to live below it, not because you lack willpower, but because doing so feels like deprivation, even when objectively you're still living better than most of the world. This is the trap. You earn more, the baseline rises to meet it. The gap between income and baseline stays the same. The system stays in equilibrium, and you stay exactly where you were before. So let's name the system. What we're describing is called lifestyle baseline expansion. But you don't need to remember that term. What matters is understanding how it works. Here's the structure. Every person has a lifestyle baseline. This is the level of spending that feels normal to them. Not extravagant, not minimal, just normal. This baseline includes rent or mortgage, transportation, food, utilities, subscriptions, entertainment, clothing, personal care, and 1,000 other micro categories that together define what your life costs. When your income is below this baseline, you feel financial stress. You're constantly making trade-offs, choosing between things, delaying purchases, living with things that are broken or outdated because replacing them isn't an option right now. When your income is above this baseline, you feel financial comfort. You stop thinking about money as much. You make purchases without the mental friction. You say yes to things more easily. Now here's the critical part. Your brain doesn't like living below the baseline. It interprets it as deprivation, as going backward, as failure. But your brain is perfectly comfortable with the baseline rising. In fact, your brain barely notices when it happens, because each individual increase is small, justifiable, rational. $20 more a month for better internet, that's nothing. $15 more for a gym membership at a nicer place, makes sense. $30 more on groceries because you're buying healthier food, That's an investment in your health. An extra $100 a month on rent because the new place is closer to work, you're saving time. Time is money. Each decision in isolation is completely reasonable. And that's what makes this so insidious. You're not being irrational. You're not making obviously bad choices. Every single upgrade has a legitimate justification behind it. Better internet actually does make your work from home setup more effective. A nicer gym actually might mean you use it more consistently. Healthier food actually is better for you. Living closer to work actually does give you back hours every week. These aren't lies you're telling yourself. They're real benefits, real improvements to your quality of life. The problem isn't that any individual decision is wrong. The problem is that you're making these decisions in isolation, one at a time, without seeing the cumulative effect, without recognizing that each small upgrade is a permanent increase to your cost of living, without calculating that $20 here and $30 there and $100 somewhere else eventually adds up to the entire amount of your raise, plus a little more. But here's what happens over time. Those $20, $30, $100 increases add up, and they compound, and they become permanent. Because once you've upgraded something, downgrading feels like a loss. Once you've moved into the nicer apartment, moving back into the old one feels like going backward. Once you've gotten used to ordering delivery twice a week, cooking every night feels like extra work you shouldn't have to do anymore. The baseline has shifted. And now, to save money, you don't just need to avoid future increases, you need to actively reverse decisions you've already made, which feels, to your brain, like punishing yourself. So you don't do it, and the baseline stays where it is, or keeps rising. This is the system. It's not personal weakness, it's not lack of knowledge, it's not even lack of discipline, necessarily. It's a structural pattern that operates mostly below conscious awareness, adjusting your spending to match your income almost automatically. And the result is that no matter how much you earn, if the baseline keeps pace with income growth, you never get ahead. You just live a slightly more expensive version of the same financial position. Now let's look at why common financial advice fails inside this system. The most common advice people hear is this: live below your means. It's good advice, correct advice even, but it misses something fundamental. Because living below your means assumes that your means is a fixed number, and your lifestyle is something you consciously control. But we've just seen that's not how it works. Your means increase. Your lifestyle baseline increases to match. The gap between them stays the same. So telling someone to live below their means without addressing the baseline expansion system is like telling someone to run faster on a treadmill that speeds up every time they do. Technically possible, extremely difficult in practice. Here's another piece of common advice. Pay yourself first. The idea is simple. Before you spend anything, automatically move a percentage of your income into savings or investment accounts. That way, you're building wealth before you have a chance to spend the money. Again, good advice. But here's what actually happens for most people. They set up the automatic transfer. Let's say 10% of their paycheck goes straight to savings. Great. But now they're living on 90% of their income. And over time, their lifestyle baseline expands to fill that 90%. They don't feel like they're saving. They feel like they're living on less than they make. Which technically they are. That's the point. But psychologically, it doesn't feel like building wealth. It feels like constraint. And when an unexpected expense comes up, car repair, medical bill, wedding gift, anything that doesn't fit into the 90%, they pull from savings. Because the savings don't feel like wealth. They feel like overflow, like the money that was left over after living costs. And over time, the savings account becomes an emergency fund that gets drained and refilled in a cycle that never actually accumulates. The advice isn't wrong, but it's incomplete. It doesn't account for the psychological system that treats baseline expenses as sacred and everything above that as negotiable. One more piece of advice. Track your spending. The logic is that if you see where your money's going, you'll make better decisions. You'll cut the waste, eliminate the unnecessary. And for some people this works, at least temporarily. But here's what most people discover when they track their spending. Almost everything feels necessary. The rent is necessary. The car payment's necessary, the insurance is necessary, the phone bill's necessary, the groceries are necessary, the gas is necessary. Even the things that aren't strictly necessary feel justified in context. The streaming subscriptions, the occasional takeout, the coffee on the way to work. These aren't extravagances, they're small comforts in an otherwise stressful life. And cutting them feels like deprivation, like making life harder for yourself in exchange for saving, what, $50, $100? It doesn't feel worth it. So the tracking becomes just observation, awareness without action, which is useful in a way, but it doesn't solve the baseline problem. Here's what the tracking reveals that nobody wants to acknowledge. You're not overspending on luxuries. You're spending exactly what it costs to live the life you've come to consider normal. The numbers aren't shocking. There's no obvious villain in the spreadsheet, no category where you're hemorrhaging money irresponsibly. Just a long list of things that all make sense, that all serve a purpose, that all contribute to a functioning adult life. The problem isn't that you're buying things you don't need. The problem is that your definition of need has quietly expanded to include things that used to be wants or things that didn't exist in your life 5 years ago. The tracking shows you exactly where the money goes. What it doesn't show you is how to want less, how to need less, how to redefine normal in a way that doesn't feel like punishment. None of this advice is bad, but none of it directly addresses the core issue. The baseline expands to meet income, and once it expands, contracting it feels like loss. That's the system. And until you see the system clearly, the advice just feels like more things you should be doing, but somehow aren't. Let's go deeper into why this baseline expansion happens so automatically. Part of it is social. The people around you set a reference point for what normal looks like. If your friends go out to eat regularly, eating out becomes normal. Not a treat, not a luxury, just what people do. If your coworkers have new cars, driving an older car starts to feel like a statement, like you're signaling something about your status or success. If everyone in your neighborhood has certain things, lawn care services, home security systems, annual vacations, not having those things becomes conspicuous. You're not trying to keep up with anyone consciously, but the definition of normal is being set by your environment. And normal is powerful because living below normal feels like underachieving, like you're not where you should be. This isn't vanity, it's not shallowness, it's basic human psychology. We assess our position relative to the people around us, and when the people around us are spending at a certain level, that level becomes the baseline. And here's what makes the social component so particularly effective at driving baseline expansion. The comparison isn't just about possessions, it's about ease, about margin, about the absence of visible struggle. When your peers seem to handle expenses effortlessly, they never mention splitting checks, never hesitate before booking trips, never talk about budgets or constraints. It creates an invisible pressure. Not to own what they own, necessarily, but to project the same financial ease, the same unbothered relationship with money. And projecting ease requires actually spending with ease. Hesitating before a purchase signals constraint. Suggesting a cheaper restaurant signals limitation. So you spend as if you have margin, even when you don't, because the alternative is admitting, constantly and publicly, that you're operating closer to your limit than everyone around you appears to be. But here's the other part, and this one is even more subtle. Your brain adapts to positive changes faster than it adapts to negative ones. When you get a raise, you feel good about it for a little while, but the feeling fades. It becomes normal, expected. When you buy something new, a better car, a nicer apartment, a piece of technology you've been wanting, there's a spike of satisfaction, and then it fades. This is called hedonic adaptation, your brain's ability to return to a neutral baseline no matter what improves. It's a useful survival mechanism. It prevents you from being permanently distressed by bad circumstances, but it also prevents you from being permanently satisfied by good ones. So the raise that felt significant 3 months ago now just feels like your normal income. The apartment that felt like an upgrade now just feels like where you live. The nicer car is just your car. The satisfaction fades, but the cost remains. And because the cost remains, your baseline has permanently increased. You're now spending more than you were before, but you're not any happier. You've traded temporary satisfaction for permanent expense. And this happens over and over, with every small upgrade, every incremental improvement, every decision to buy the slightly better version. None of these decisions feel significant in the moment, but in aggregate, over years, they completely reshape your financial position. And here's the part that makes this so difficult to reverse. Once you've experienced the better version, going back feels like a downgrade, even if the old version was perfectly fine at the time, even if you were happy with it. Once you've upgraded, the old version becomes unacceptable. Your baseline has shifted, and shifting it back requires not just discipline, but a willingness to feel like you're going backward. Most people aren't willing to do that, so the baseline stays, or keeps rising. And wealth, real wealth, accumulated wealth, never builds, because every increase in income gets absorbed into an increase in baseline. The same gap stays. The system stays in equilibrium.
So here's the reframe. Wealth isn't built by earning more. Wealth is built by creating a gap between income and baseline, and then keeping that gap open as income rises. That's it. The entire mechanism of wealth accumulation comes down to that single principle. Keep the gap open. Most people do the opposite. They earn more and they close the gap. They let the baseline rise to meet the new income. And because the gap closes, no wealth accumulates. They're running faster, but they're not moving forward. Now, this doesn't mean you should never improve your quality of life. That's not realistic, and it's not the point. The point is to understand that every time you increase your baseline, you're making a trade-off. You're trading potential wealth accumulation for current lifestyle improvement. Neither choice is wrong, but most people don't realize they're making a choice at all. They think they're just living normally, reasonably, the way anyone in their position would live. And because they don't see it as a choice, they can't control it. Think about what this means in practical terms. When you get a raise and immediately upgrade your apartment, you're not just spending more on rent. You're choosing current comfort over future freedom. When you finance a newer car because you can now afford the payment, you're not just buying transportation. You're converting potential wealth into a depreciating asset and years of monthly obligations. When you add services and subscriptions because they're only small amounts each month, you're not just making life more convenient. You're locking in permanent expenses that will require permanent income to sustain. None of these are bad decisions inherently, but they are decisions, and most people make them without recognizing that they're deciding between two different financial futures, one where wealth accumulates, and one where income and lifestyle stay locked in permanent equilibrium. But once you see the system, once you see that your baseline is not fixed, that it's something that expands and contracts based on 1,000 small decisions, you can start making those decisions consciously. You can decide where you want the baseline to be, not based on what feels normal, not based on what other people are doing, not based on what you can technically afford, but based on what you actually want your financial life to look like in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. Because here's the truth. The gap between income and baseline is the only source of wealth for most people. It's not windfalls, it's not investment returns, at least not at first. It's not side hustles or promotions or inheritances. It's the gap. And the gap only exists if you create it deliberately and protect it consistently. That's the mental shift. It's not about earning more. It's not even about spending less exactly. It's about seeing your baseline as something you control, something you design, something you choose, not something that just happens to you. So what changes when you start thinking this way? First, you stop assuming that your next raise will solve your financial stress, because you understand now that unless something else changes, the raise will just get absorbed into a higher baseline. The stress will return. The gap will close. You'll be back where you started, just with bigger numbers. So instead of waiting for more income, you start examining the baseline itself. Where is it higher than it needs to be? Not based on judgment or guilt, but just based on what you actually value. Are there parts of your spending that don't contribute meaningfully to your life?
things you're paying for out of habit or momentum, or because they used to matter but don't anymore, those are the places where the baseline can contract without feeling like deprivation. Because you're not cutting things you care about, you're cutting things that have quietly become part of the baseline without earning their place there. This requires a level of honesty that most people avoid, because when you actually examine your spending against what you claim to value, the misalignment is often stark. You say you value experiences over things, but you're spending twice as much on a car payment than on travel. You say you value health, but the gym membership you're paying for hasn't been used in 4 months, while the delivery app gets opened 3 times a week. You say you value financial security, but you're carrying a baseline that requires every dollar you make plus a little more. These aren't moral failures. They're just gaps between stated values and revealed preferences, and they represent opportunities. Not to punish yourself, but to realign, to ask which parts of your current baseline are actually serving the life you want, and which parts are just momentum from decisions you made years ago that no longer apply. Second, you start evaluating upgrades differently. When you're considering something that will permanently increase your baseline, a nicer apartment, a car payment, a subscription service, you don't just ask, can I afford this? You ask, is this worth the permanent reduction in my wealth accumulation rate? Because that's what it is. Every permanent increase in baseline is a permanent decrease in the gap, which means a permanent decrease in how fast you're building wealth. Maybe it's worth it. Maybe the upgrade genuinely improves your life in a way that justifies the cost. But now you're making that trade-off consciously. You're not just drifting into a higher baseline because it feels normal or because you technically have the income to support it. Third, you start to see wealth accumulation as something that happens now, not later. Most people think they'll start saving seriously once they earn more, once they pay off this debt, once the kids are out of the house, once something changes. But if the baseline always rises to meet income, that moment never comes. There's always a reason to wait, always something that feels more pressing, always a baseline expense that needs to be covered first. Wealth builds when you create the gap now at whatever income level you're at, and then protect that gap as income grows, not when income reaches some magical threshold where saving becomes easy. Because it never becomes easy. The baseline will always expand to make it feel just as tight as it did before, unless you stop it.
Most people never build wealth. Not because they don't earn enough, not because they don't understand money, not because they lack discipline or intelligence, but because they're operating inside a system they don't see. A system where income and baseline rise together, keeping the gap closed, preventing accumulation, keeping them in the same relative position year after year. The system isn't malicious, it's not even intentional. It's just how human psychology and social reference points and hedonic adaptation interact with money. But once you see it, you can step outside of it. You can decide where your baseline sits. You can protect the gap. You can let income rise without letting the baseline rise with it. And when you do that, everything changes. Not overnight, not dramatically, but consistently, cumulatively, over time. Because compound growth requires something to compound. And if there's no gap, if every dollar you earn is immediately absorbed into a higher baseline, there's nothing to compound. The math can't work. You can read every investing book, understand every strategy, know exactly what you should be doing with money, and none of it matters if there's no excess to invest. The gap is the raw material. Everything else is just what you do with it once it exists. But it has to exist first. And it only exists if you create it deliberately and defend it consistently against the constant pressure to let it close. Because wealth isn't built by earning more. It's built by keeping the gap open.